Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to get started tonight. I think we will have a lot more people joining over the next few minutes. But in the meantime, we wanted to welcome you and thank you for joining our inaugural book club and speaker series at the Frontline of Change, Positive Acts in Planning. I'm Gretchen Worth. I'm the project director of the Susan Christofferson Center for Community Planning, the organizer of the series. The Christofferson Center works across New York State to support communities in planning for a more equitable, climate-resilient built environment. We've introduced this unique series as a way to offer conversation around New York State challenges and opportunities in the planning space. We're really excited about tonight's program, which takes as its jumping off point the recently published book, The Great Displacement, Climate Change and the Next American Migration by Jake Biddle. If you haven't read it, it's okay, but we do highly recommend it. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping details. We really will try to keep this event to an hour. We have a very jam-packed schedule that we're excited to share with you. The first half includes a conversation with our speakers and moderator to hear their takeaways on the book. That will be followed by a short presentation about the Nature Conservancy's work in climate adaptation. The second half of the program, we're going to be talking about the role of professional planners and communities in addressing climate migration in New York State. We really hope that you will all participate in that part of the event with your questions and comments by putting them into the chat function, and we'll incorporate as many as we can in that last half hour. We also have some poll questions that we'll be asking throughout the session, and we'd love to get as many of your responses as we can. And so, Galiba, that would be a great opportunity right now for you to launch that first poll if you can. So in the meantime, also, please keep yourselves muted so that everyone can hear our conversation tonight. We are recording the event, and we will share that out afterwards to everyone who's registered. So thanks to the American Planning Association Upstate New York chapter, we're offering CM credit to AICP members for the event this evening. If you would like to receive credit, please email info@christoffersoncenter.org. It's down at the bottom of the screen, and include your name and affiliation and put June 7th speaker series in the subject line. Our next book, Poverty by America, authored by Pulitzer Prize winner Matthew Desmond, is scheduled for the fall when we resume this series. So please stay tuned for more details as well as future books and speakers. And you can always check in at christoffersoncenter.org for updates and registration information. So I don't know if we have poll results yet back from where people are tuning in from that anybody would like to share. I know from our registration that we had people joining from across and beyond New York State. I'm based in Ithaca, and so would like to acknowledge that Ithaca is on the traditional homelands of the Guy-Cahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Guy-Cahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Guy-Cahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Guy-Cahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So the headlines you're seeing on the screen are not from yesterday or last week or even last month. Climate migration, domestically, globally, has been an issue for a very long time, but its impacts are becoming more and more tangible for all of us and our communities, and require urgent action and planning. New York State, as I'm sure many of you know, is projected to be a net recipient of climate migrants in the coming years. Buffalo has already begun marketing itself as a climate haven. But here in New York, we will also see an exodus across state lines for others due to sea level rise or other climate events. Some of you may be considering it this week even, having spent the past days experiencing the detrimental impact of Canada's wildfires on our air quality here. So to discuss the topic tonight, I'm delighted to welcome our speakers and moderator. Dr. Allison Bronco is the Director of Climate Adaptation for the Nature Conservancy in New York. where she works with communities and governments to plan for and adapt to climate change. Allison holds degrees from Connecticut College and the University of Connecticut and has work experience on the East Coast of the US and in Western Australia. Most recently, she served as director of the Peconic Estuary Program, part of EPA's National Estuary Program. Now with the Nature Conservancy, she leads a statewide team engaging across New York's diverse floodplains to help build healthy and resilient shoreline communities for the long-term benefit of both people and nature. Stevie Adams is a senior climate adaptation specialist with the Nature Conservancy in New York and is part of a team that works to protect and restore floodplains and coasts to help human and ecological communities adapt to climate change. She's a certified floodplain manager with the Association of State Floodplain Managers and co-chairs the Training and Outreach Committee of New York State Chapter, the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association. She has recently co-authored a paper that proposes, quote, a new framework for flood adaptation, introducing the flood adaptation hierarchy. Prior to her joining the Nature Conservancy, Stevie managed stream restoration and burial removal projects in the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy and the California Conservation Corps. She holds a Master of Science in Biology from California State University of Northridge. Kate Maynard is an advisory board member of the Christopherson Center and serves as the Planning and Economic Development Director for the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. She was previously the principal planner for the city of Saratoga Springs. Kate is also an adjunct professor with the University of Albany and serves on the boards of the Sobro Conservancy and Friends of Saratoga County Animal Shelter, as well as the Community Advisory Board for University at Albany Geography and Planning Department. Kate's wide diversity of work experiences include urban revitalization, community and economic development, open space and trails planning, and inclusive community engagement. So thank you all three for being here today. I want to kick off with a question to get us started on the book discussion about the Great Displacement, and just wondering if you could share with us your views about a particular issue or story within the book that really resonated with you and stood out. So I'm going to pass it over to the three of you, and thank you.
Thanks, Gretchen, for a great introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you all, with great company in terms of my panel speakers, as well as the audience as a whole. I want to share my first personal connection to this topic. And it was about 15 years ago that I received a call from someone that identified themselves as a climate refugee. They were calling from the West Coast of the United States, and they were researching where to go next. They were perceiving there were climate issues happening then and in the future, and basically they wanted out, and they were really evaluating opportunities for where they could go next. So two things really stopped me in my tracks in terms of this conversation, again, 15 years ago. One was that term climate refugee, and second was the scale and the research that was going into this family's potential move elsewhere, based on the perceived impacts of climate change at that point. So fast forward to now, 2023, and the first thing that stands out to me from the Great Displacement in my own experiences is that we're really in, I think, a new phase of climate change. From the point of alarm bells sounding over the past few decades to from the science points of view, and really kind of sounding in terms of what would be future impacts, we're now really starting to directly see or even be impacted in our own individual daily lives. Those paying attention have been seeing the growing impacts in other parts of the world, such as the global south, and the migration occurring due to this. And now we're really starting to even witness recurring evolving impacts here in the US, whether it be drought, wildfires, flooding, to more devastating hurricanes, to running out of water in the Southwest. This is not a sci-fi summary in terms of a new movie that's coming out. These are things that are happening now in today's era. So I think too of Biddle's comment in the book, and Gretchen alluded to it, in terms of there's really no perfect climate haven safe from all impacts. So while communities on really kind of the pioneering frontage of this era, such as Buffalo, are really kind of putting out the notice of being a climate haven, Biddle really cites early on that there's really no completely safe place from, there's just better ones that are better oriented or better situated in terms of those impacts. So again, I think of the wildfires in Canada, and in really that sense of New York City. The headline today that was unfortunate to read is that the air quality there is actually the worst in all the cities across the entire world. So that kind of is a bit jarring in terms of things. Before delving in further, though, we do want to note that as a panel and with you all as an audience, the desire is to provide a space to consider and discuss this topic. Not all aspects of this conversation will be doom and gloom, especially as we turn to potential opportunities along with these challenges for the Northeast. So we do want to cite that. We don't want to see our participation level go down to 2 as people are kind of thinking this isn't something they can handle. So we want to note that as well. So turning to Gretchen's questions and what she asked, just to kick things off here, I want to kind of mention what really impacted me and was kind of a recurring theme throughout the conversation. And that really was one in the discussion of land use. So really what's been allowed in terms of human activity. And I think in this consideration, it's on or below the surface that's really being discussed. So through the stories of development, for those who were able to read the book, or hopefully if you haven't, you will have a chance to be able to delve into it. Biddle really does this great job of talking about stories of development into vulnerable areas. So there's the discussion of California and the overall wildfires and people's personal stories as they move through temporary to sometimes permanent displacement from that. And then there's discussion of places like Louisiana and the Bayou in terms of the drilling activity that started and that came in a major way and physically altered the entire area and really erased those natural barriers to flood protection. So there's this overall theme that really struck me as, you know, people as a whole and how we've exerted our will to conquer natural barriers. And then how, you know, we've really been aided through technology and engineering to erase or at least kind of push back those prior hard stops to development. So thinking of things through such as air conditioning, that invention allowed people to move en masse into the Southeast and be able to live there comfortably. They moved there for the climate, but then they also had the ability to turn on the AC when things get a little too hot in the summertime. Engineering. So looking at the ability to pump vast quantities of water out of the aquifers and rivers like the Colorado to live in the Southwest. That's obviously a theme that's talked about quite a bit. Just the sheer scale of, say, large-scale machinery that allows you to more quickly clear vast amounts of trees and natural landscapes. And with that, systems such as green infrastructure, and replace that with engineered contours, structures, and impervious surfaces. So as we keep reading through these detailed, really personal stories, and again, I think that's a highlight of the book, which is really showcasing individual and families, decisions that have to be made, things that happen to them, and what really kind of leads them to move ultimately in many cases, is really that question I kept going back to as a reader is, just because we can do these things, should we? And so I think that's a question that really kind of resonated both within that conversation and then always in looking forward to, you know, how can we take that question in terms of decisions that are being made now in our own localities, both in response to this particular topic, but then as a whole in terms of our land use activities. So as a planner, that's something that really resonated with me. And then the second one I'll mention is this interwoven theme of really displaying the deficiencies. So I believe a lot of planners are probably on this call, so well-versed or knowledgeable of local zoning and land use policies. So Biddle really is calling out how deficient the overall controls for development as a whole or intensity of development, and then in permitting this building in vulnerable areas and the prices that people are paying for this in extreme ways that can force them to move elsewhere. So I think one particularly poignant chapter in the book that really kind of hit that home for me, as well as just, again, this is real life. So looking at recent headlines is what's going on out in Arizona and the situation of the water shortages. So really looking at the situation of obviously an extreme hotspot in terms of development. People have been really moving out there en masse, and that both rivers and aquifers have been really overutilized and been drawn upon to really support that development as a whole, from the waterfalls in Las Vegas for those who have had a chance to visit out there, to just the vast tracts of residential areas, many of them replicating, say, with manicured lawns, the areas they came from, the Northeast, that aren't natural to the Southwest. There's this question of really exceeding our natural carrying capacity as a whole, and those decisions that are made. I thought one interesting question that Biddle posed in that chapter on Arizona that's pretty relevant now as we see Phoenix literally putting the stops on serving development outside their limits is, he asks, quote, how do we decide when to stop building, and what do we do when there isn't enough to go around? When does a place put up a no vacancy sign and tell people to move elsewhere? So those are two particular things that resonated. And I also want to note, this isn't meant to be an overall soapbox moment or scolding of these locations, but it is acknowledging that government at all levels, which are obviously influenced and made up of people, have catered to the sense of unsustainable growth being supported in all locations and subsidize this sense of the safety net to allow people to live as they see fit, where they see fit, and that profit's king in our overall capitalist society. And also just, being aware too of immense political pressure, the sense of short-term benefits that are obviously very critical to someone in an elected position or able to be influenced by tax base, helping your community in terms of local economy, rooftops equaling growth, and seen as an overall good for the area. And just to leave it before I turn over to Allison and Stevie, we'll return to, I think, some of these themes that can put in the framework of what have we learned? How can we do better? And then what can we really turn to in terms of our either climate resiliency planning efforts or efforts that touch on climate migration for people who are currently living with us, our current residents, and then potential future residents. So that was land use. I'm going to turn it over to Stevie next, who's going to explore her thoughts related to what resonated with her from the book.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks so much for inviting Alice and I to be here tonight. This is pretty exciting. This is a book I'm not sure I would have picked up for the reasons that we mentioned earlier about it just maybe being a little bit of a downer, but I really was very impressed with how the author handled this very tough topic and the stories that he told. So, and the amount of research that must have gone into this. So it was very impressive. I would really recommend folks read it if they didn't. And I also wanted to read a quote from this book because I think, obviously I shouldn't say obviously, the things that really bowled me over were about equity and how these communities are being shaped and shifted based on a number of different equity questions that I'll get into in just a minute. But I wanted to read this quote that says, and this is about the Lincoln City, North Carolina story. And it says, the buyout was the city's first real attempt to pull back from the river, and it foreshadowed a pattern that would soon emerge all over the country. The burden of relocation would fall on those who had the least ability to resist it. And so this really speaks to, I think, a number of different equity issues, I'll say, that we have certainly been seeing across the country when we have worked with academics to take a look at buyout programs across the country. And so, for example, the research is really kind of catching up on these equity questions, I think. And so we're seeing a lot more of the story coming out in the literature. But we can I think we can say with some certainty that those that are most vulnerable are experiencing more stress and lose a greater proportion of their wealth during and after an event. So I think we really need to be asking ourselves questions and being very thoughtful about these questions, not just kind of breezing through them, but really thinking through what the answers are. So for example, we really need to be thinking about who is experiencing short and long-term impacts, who's experiencing impacts disproportionately. The literature is definitely indicating that we have that vulnerable people really have limited ability to influence the governance process. That's not just about flooding. That's about a lot of different issues, but it's relevant to this conversation, flooding. So whose voices are and should be included in land use planning and management decision making? We really need to be thinking about that. Like, is everybody sitting at the table, and are they being given the opportunity to speak up in a way where they'll be heard? And then lastly, we're definitely seeing that vulnerable people receive fewer mitigation and recovery resources. that we really should be asking ourselves: who receives resources before and after flooding? What are specific community needs? And bringing the community to the table with us. So there are just some thoughts that occurred to me while I was reading this. Thanks. And Allison, I know we're a little bit behind schedule. So Allison, you've got
I'll be brief.
some thoughts. I'll turn it over.
Yeah, thank you both. And I just want to echo what Kate and Stevie have both said. It's not all doom and gloom. There are opportunities in this mix. And I too would highly recommend this book. And what's so interesting to me about it is I think the author did such a great job of putting this issue of climate migration into the housing context. Because, until now, really, climate migration that happened certainly within the United States was all about disaster recovery. It was like, if it's so bad you can't rebuild the house, then maybe you buy it and send those people on their merry way. And, after a hurricane, after a flood, that sort of thing, that's when houses were bought and people moved elsewhere because of a disaster. So it was really all about reducing the government's disaster recovery burden. And it was not about having our population in a safe place to live. And I think we're in this moment in time right now, especially in New York State, but I think nationwide, but especially in New York State with recent housing proposal by the governor that didn't actually happen. But it's really gotten people talking. We have a housing crisis as it is. With a stable, fabulous climate, we would have a housing crisis in New York. And until recently, that was an excuse to not talk about climate migration because nobody wanted to talk about further reducing the available housing stock. But I think everyone is starting to come around to understand that, flood-prone housing or other kind of climate disaster-prone housing, like fire-prone housing, is not a viable, safe, long-term place for people. And so it's not because we want to talk about climate migration that it's problematic. It just is. Mother Nature is the one pushing people out. And so to really get everybody into some safe, stable housing, we need to understand these climate impacts, and we need to create new safe places to live. And I think in New York, there are many parts of the state that see this as an opportunity. And, New York is such an interesting place because we have all the kinds of flooding, river flooding and coastal flooding, and even the Great Lakes are flooding. But we also have a lot of areas that aren't. So I think there are opportunities for places that are high and dry, and that could be because people are going to move from one part of the state to another, or even from other states into our state, or it even is just within a neighborhood. People are going to move from the coast to several blocks inland where it's higher and safer. And I think that we really need to think of this issue in the context of housing, the currently available safe housing stock, and the need to kind of add more safe housing stock because the unsafe housing stock is being reduced very rapidly thanks to climate change. I'll stop there.
So we are running behind. This is such a big topic. But Allison and Stevie, would you like to share more about the work that the Nature Conservancy is doing in this area?
Sure. I'm going to take the lead here, but Stevie's going to jump in every time I forget to say something important. I'm just going to share my screen if that's okay. Get the right view up for you all, please. There we go. So Stevie and I are part of a team of 8 of us all across the state in New York, focused on climate adaptation. And our team is really focused on flooding because in addition to heat, that's the biggest impact that we're seeing across New York. And these are just a couple of examples of things that we've seen in the last several years. And I think most of the people it looked like on the call are from New York. So, we've got all sorts of different kinds of floods happening because of rainfall, because of sea level rise, because of big storms, rainstorms and coastal storms and all sorts of things. It's a real problem in New York. And the main reason is what Kate was talking about. We have built ourselves right up to the edge of the water, expecting those lines between land and water to be permanent. And the fact is that's just not how nature works. And what's more, those floodable areas, that sort of boundary between the land and the water, is a really important space, not just for the ecosystem, though it is very important for the ecosystem, but it also has the potential to help buffer us people from the damaging effects of the water if we allow it to act in that way, if we keep it natural and allow it to buffer those effects that happen when people are living where the water is trying to be. And so those floodplain areas and shorelines too, but this slide is talking about floodplain. Those floodplain areas, we are continuing even today to put development pressure and add more housing into those flood prone areas of our state, some places at a pretty fast rate. And that's really scary to us because, you know, we already have a tremendous problem. We already have hundreds of thousands of homes in danger of flooding today. Then with climate change, that flood zone is growing. And now we're continuing to add more houses in there. So one thing that the Nature Conservancy really focuses on is that problem, the fact that we're actually making the problem worse. But what I really want to talk about is that sort of conflict between the people and the water. When we're living where the water is trying to be, traditionally, the response to that conflict has been to build something to defend ourselves, a levee, a seawall, what have you, to keep the water out. And then when that stops working, then sometimes we do things to accommodate all that water. For example, we raise houses or we make our bridges bigger. And then only as a last resort have people been moving and doing what we like to call making way for water, backing up and making room for that water. That has been really only a last resort, really only if it's an unsalvageable situation. And by government standards, technically, only if buying the house is cheaper than rebuilding it in place. And that's sort of the system that we've been working with. And what our team would propose is that what we want for our future, the long-term future of our society, is a resilient society. And that's one of those buzzwords that we don't like to say because everybody thinks it means something different. But really, on a shoreline or a coastline, a riverbank, what that means is a holistic resilience for the community. We need clean water. We need dynamic sediment, meaning that sediment needs to move around because that's what sediment does, sand, dirt, all of those things. We need the full range of water levels and flow regimes, the little trickle all the way up to the big splashy flood. And we need room to move. Those natural systems along the shoreline are very resilient and can move and change to adapt to changes in water levels, but only if they're allowed to do so, which means that we have to be out of their way and not messing around with them. And so we really think that nature has an increasingly important role to play in helping to sort of resolve that conflict between the people and water. We need to start taking advantage of that natural resilience of the environment to help protect us from flooding and erosion. And so what we would propose is that typical paradigm of defend, accommodate, and retreat in that order is backwards, exactly backwards. We need to flip it around entirely. And what we would propose is that anytime we're talking about the land-water interface, we should first and foremost protect those places that are still natural. Like they say in medicine, first do no harm. Let's not make this problem any worse. Let's not add new development into vulnerable areas. Next, in the places where it's too late for that, which is a lot of places, we need to help people back up away from the water's edge, make way for water, and get to safer housing. And then after that, we can talk about accommodating the water and really reserve those hardened defenses that provide a false sense of security for people and are super harmful to the environment. Those need to be our last resort and really reserved for the cases where they're absolutely necessary. And so if this is the right sort of order of operations, you can see why climate migration plays such an important role in a future that is resilient. And so that is why it's so important that we resolve some of these issues that we've been talking about. And, you know, to make this order of operations happen, we think incentives are an important tool, especially for the prevention of new development in those places that are still natural. Regulations, of course, are always an important tool. And then planning is essential. Our team has a whole bunch of recommendations that we've been sharing with state and city government about how to do a buyout program, and like half of them are about planning because that's such a key piece to getting it done correctly. So our team has been doing a lot of work. I'm just going to back up for a second on the sort of left side of this sequence. So we've been trying to do a lot to investigate incentives for helping landowners that own natural floodplains and shorelines keep them that way. We've been doing a lot of work about buyout programs, how to make that climate migration result in better outcomes, both for the people who are leaving a home and for the land that's left behind. All kinds of different experiments, trying to improve the process, trying to test ways to help make sure people get to a better place and don't wind up in a home that's just as vulnerable as the one that they've just left, that sort of thing. And we also do a little bit of work on the accommodate side, mostly where we have road stream crossings, trying to promote the upgrade of those crossings to be much bigger to accommodate the full range of flow that stream has, which is both protective for the environment. It allows a lot better connectivity for animals and critters, but also for people, because then those bridges and roads are washed out a lot less often due to floods. So we are spending a lot of time trying to keep natural floodplains natural and make developed floodplains back into being natural. We'd like to say undevelopment.
Thanks so much, Allison. I think that there will be some room for everyone to comment on in just a moment, but we now want to transition into the last half hour of our event, where we'd love to hear from all of you who've joined us on the call. Here in New York State, we're really at a critical juncture regarding climate migration, both in and out of the state. And so the question that we're posing to all of you is, what role can and should planners be playing? Allison talked about this in her presentation. Jake Biddle talks about it in his book. Stevie and Kate have both addressed this in their comments. And so we'd love to hear from you, either questions to our speakers tonight, thoughts about parts of the book, if you read the book, that really resonated with you around the idea of the planning profession and how, as Allison said, the planning profession can help improve outcomes and really, rather than do no harm. And so please go ahead and put your questions and comments in the chat. You can also use the hand raise function if you'd like to be called on. And so I'm going to turn it back to Kate, Allison, and Stevie to talk a little bit more about their views about planners and how that relates to our current situation here in New York State. But we would love to hear from you. So thanks, and over to the three of you again.
Stevie or Allison, would you like to provide your comments and I can conclude? Would you like me to go first? Okay. So to quickly cover the poll results, looks like folks are really chiming in terms of providing specific funding to communities being very key, how the state can support communities, make more investment in housing, a really important function. And Allison talked a lot about that in her conversation or her comments, and educating and engaging with communities as kind of the top three there. So obviously not all mutually exclusive. They're all very important to some degree, right? So just to offer a couple comments and get really things kickstarted. Again, we're looking forward to audience questions and comments as well to have an engaging conversation. But in terms of the role that planners really should be playing, or how we can kind of be involved in this. So I'm a planner at the regional aspect of things. So in the capital region, primarily that's Albany, Rensselaer, Schenectady, and Saratoga counties. But I think one of the critical things that really needs to be looked at with this issue of climate migration is really integrating it into both current and future planning activities and implementation. So I think from a planning perspective, we can really see climate migration as a really significant part of the continuum. So what we're seeing in terms of climate change impacts, what's really adding on to what Allison had discussed in terms of climate resiliency and adaptation, really looking at what really needs to happen at that locality and that regional level in terms of adapting to what changes are coming, and looking at those really critical issues of housing, transportation, the whole spectrum of things that you'd want to look at, how you're physically developing. And I think the added sense of it is you're looking at it for not just current residents and future that you expect, but also scenarios that do involve, what does it look like if we have say, gradual increases in population, if we have sudden spurts related to what's happening in other parts of the country. So I think that's the first thing that really comes to mind as a planner is, I think you have a strength in terms of having this be part of overall planning efforts and not necessarily being the focus of its own focused efforts that may have the risk of either being put on the shelf or not making important connections to other themes and other activities where possible. So I'll offer that as a first comment. And Allison, Stevie, please chime in.
Yeah, I'll say too, I think often, we like to say that people are just living where they shouldn't. And we've told people they should live in these risky places. And, sometimes I think the blame unfairly goes on the planning community. I think we as a society, our entire land use system is based on this idea that you can draw a line on a map and it'll be there forever. And, I think our scientific understanding, and especially the change in climate and our understanding of that, has led us to see that that's just not the reality that we should be planning in. So I think there's a real opportunity there for the planning community to sort of take that on and say, how can we do this differently? Because those lines on a map aren't the thing that we should be working with anymore. And I think, our team has done a little bit of looking into existing planning processes that municipalities typically do and where the opportunities are to plan for migration, because creating a new plan is never the first choice, because as you all know, communities get a little sick of planning. And comprehensive plans really float to the top. And in part, that's because they're supposed to be, although I know they're not always, but they're supposed to be updated fairly frequently. And so that's a good place that you can sort of like delve in a little bit and then 5 years later really start planning for it, and then 5 years later really start to make it happen. And the other reason that that's a good place, a comprehensive plan is a good place to do it, is because it's really kind of like the spatial land use plan for municipalities. So it allows you to plan both for places you need to migrate out of, as well as places people might want to migrate into. And I think, there's been a lot less attention until just recently on the in-migration side of things. But I think communities that are either against their will or because they're asking for it are facing an in-migration from people moving out of unsafe places. I think they need just as much help and resources and grants and everything as the people who have to plan for managed retreat from flood zones, for example. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, and I would love to hear from this group on the phone any suggestions for other sort of mechanisms that they think, rather than asking a municipality to do a whole separate climate adaptation plan that's unrelated to everything they do, how else can it be incorporated into what they're already doing, their existing processes, to make it more effective and also make it something that's actually going to get implemented and, like Kate said, not sit on the shelf.
So one of the comments in the chat is from one of our attendees, Connor Healy, who works in the mortgage industry. And I won't read all of the comments, but Connor, you could also unmute yourself if you'd like and address this yourself. But one of his points is that if we continue with prioritizing single family housing, there's no way we'll be able to accommodate the regular housing crisis, let alone climate refugees. And so, Allison, I think this goes back to your views on the housing crisis as well, with or without climate migration. So if you wanted to, to speak further to that.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think, that's an easy thing to say. We should stop prioritizing single family housing. But the reason we prioritize that is because that's what people say they want, right? So what we really need is sort of a change in our culture. The whole like, it comes all the way back to George Washington, is my understanding, like the big palatial house and the big green lawn, and that's your status symbol. Like, that's our culture in America. And I think you're right. As long as the system of giving people housing is to spread them out as much as possible, we're going to run out of space. So yeah, it's not a great plan, but I think it's easier said than done to just change and start prioritizing multifamily housing, because that's not where the demand is in a lot of areas.
So up on the screen, we have a quote from the book. For those of you who read the book, you know that he has chosen different geographies around the country to talk about the various crises that they are facing around climate migration. But then at the end, he talks about what that looks like for the rest of us in the future. And he specifically hones in, as you can see from this quote, on the area that many of us are living in right now. So the Rust Belt, cities that border the Great Lakes. And so there is a question from Ann Rhodes saying that she would be interested in hearing about ideas for communities that are not in specific major danger, but will likely see a lot of in-migration.
So I think as a planner, just to kind of chime in initially, I think the whole question of just amplification comes to mind, right? So you're doing your job as a planner, your community's looking at things that are both current priorities and then really looking forward in terms of housing, transportation, really important areas you want to protect environmentally. You're looking now at really kind of, is there a risk of flooding? You know, what are kind of any natural risks to your community? And I think the amplification comes in with that scenario of if and when people may choose to relocate to your particular community, what that looks like. I do think that this is an opportunity to engage for really running those different scenarios, what they look like, and really working through your comprehensive planning process or other processes. Maybe it's, for example, really connecting with some of the resources at the state level, which are really starting to hone in on a lot of these aspects, and really doing the work in terms of really understanding what those scenarios look like and honing in what are priorities. It may be your community, maybe it's one of those, if you're already popular for potential in-migration, you may want to look at, you know, what is the best fit that you may have? Do you have a labor shortage? Is it where you're looking for particular labor to be able to work in your local economic drivers, you know, that are already taking place? Is population loss an opportunity? And this may not be your community, but I'm thinking of others. We were at a recent session, actually in Ithaca, held at Cornell, on this topic of climate migration, and the city of Binghamton's planner was with us. I'm not sure if she's with us tonight, but what she said really stuck with me, where she said, look, we've lost over 40% of our population, I believe is the number that she gave. So we do have room to really accommodate additional what might be flow coming back into the community. From the planning level, of course, is looking at it through that current lens. People not necessarily going to go right back to where the vacancies are, where people left, right? So it's really doing the hard work of ensuring that your policies really reflect where you want to go as a community with a heightened sense of awareness of what might be that in-migration when you expect it and when you don't, given the nature of, I think it's showing it's going to be volatile at times, you know, in terms of what's happening and what we may see in terms of in-migration when it takes place over a long period of time. So I guess I would go back to amplified. Everything's amplified. And I think my thoughts are we want to work through those existing channels and really delve into the work to be prepared for what are different scenarios of what could happen over time. So we don't have our crystal ball that's completely accurate for everything.
I'll just mention too, I think that this is, I just want to point out, I don't know that I need to, but I just want to explicitly point out that this is an incredible opportunity, right? I mean, so many of these problems that we are experiencing in really built out and developed parts of the state are there because so many of those problems are there because of past land use decisions, right? And because of the development pressure. And so in some of these towns where they're actually, you know, wanting to receive migrants, it's such an opportunity because now we understand the value of planning. We understand the impacts of natural disasters more. We understand how rivers work. We understand the importance of keeping city areas cool because of the impacts of heat. So like it's such an opportunity to like really holistically think about all of the things you just mentioned, Kate. I mean, that's a long list, but I think it's an exciting opportunity to think about being able to do it before the development pressure is there.
Or ideally.
And someone pointed out in the chat a really important thing, you know, especially for young folks, walkable communities are gaining popularity. I think there's a lot of demand for that. And it's the sort of thing that you can't really achieve until you reach a certain density. And I think, true for communities where they're not facing climate disasters and they're hoping for some in-migration to build population. But even within a community that does have an area that needs to be abandoned because of flooding or fire or what have you, the opportunity to densify in a particular downtown area near transit, to do that sort of smart growth thing. I think we need smart and climate safe growth. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to sort of, move the puzzle pieces, for lack of a better term, rearrange the people into the kind of density pattern that we wish we had, but don't have because of the sort of, long over time, somewhat haphazard way our communities have grown, a lot of them.
So there's a question in the chat for the Nature Conservancy specifically, wondering if the Nature Conservancy has advocated for specific housing policy changes in New York State in order to accommodate people who are experiencing climate-driven relocation. So the governor's housing compact talked about a need to build more to address the housing crisis, but there was no discussion about growing floodplains, sending and receiving communities, et cetera. So Stevie, Allison, you're nodding.
Yeah, our advocacy consisted primarily of pointing that out and reminding everyone that not all housing is created equal, and that, without some guardrails, you could wind up creating a lot of unsafe housing in a floodplain, for example. So that was the primary feedback that we were giving on the governor's proposal, and other things. The legislature, since that sort of fell apart, various folks in the legislature that liked pieces of it are still talking about new bills for the future. And I think that's a really big piece of our feedback, is that, yes, we need more housing in New York, and we need more than you even think because of climate change. And let's be smart about where we put that housing, not only the transit oriented kind of stuff that proposal did include, but also let's keep it out of those still undeveloped floodplains, please.
So I'm wondering if all three of you could weigh in on a question of coming back to the role of planners, and planners sitting in some cases in between the local elected leaders and then the community. And so what role do you see planners playing and being most effective in terms of both assisting local leaders to make better decisions around immigration, as well as how they can continue to educate and engage with the community around an issue that many community members may view negatively, in inward migration?
I'm happy to kick it off again. So I think many times, if you're a planner, you're either comfortable or you're aware that part of your job is not always being the most popular person in the room, and being the one that hopefully brings good data and analysis to your elected officials in terms of being able to digest themes, what might be overarching things that are happening either outside or within the community. And again, making connections. I find a big part of the role of a planner sometimes is making those connections between what may be perceived as disparate decisions or different topic areas, and making that connection to what might be opportunities or directions for your communities as a whole. So one of those things, and it's a hot button, even migration that's taking place from outside the US currently, right? There was migrants that have been brought from New York City, and there's some, I'm talking about the capital region where I am, that have been brought, and they're currently, I believe, in Colony, which is just outside Albany. And it spurs on a lot of different considerations. So one of those things that I think about is just the attitude of migration. It can be very sensitive, but really kind of maybe taking a holistic view, not only the humane treatment of people who are migrating, and really looking to kind of, as a human society, what positive reactions you can have to that, someone who is in a very bad situation, but also turning it to what might be opportunities for your community. So I have a colleague in central New York, and she was saying that was one of the things she was really working through, which is trying to really understand, because they had lost a lot of population, but the part that was gaining was actually people from elsewhere. And some were from either foreign-born individuals or moving from elsewhere in the States. And so really trying to turn that is that a positive attribute? So really looking at that is, what are things we need to plug in our community in terms of labor? What are potentially new business starts that we could look to kind of spur on by having that sort of basis, new population in our community taking place. So I think at times, again, you're not always popular, but the planner's role can be connecting all the pieces, bringing new ideas to the table. And then other examples from other communities. It might be so-and-so, provided this incentive, and this is what they saw as a result of that. Is this something that our community could really utilize? Or maybe it's connecting to, again, in my view, there's an unprecedented amount of funding. Money can't solve everything, we know that, but there's a lot of money out there to apply towards things that you want to do at especially the federal and the state level these days. So I would start with those items.
I also think an important role for planners in their communities, I think a lot of the sort of initial knee-jerk kind of reactions that are negative associated both with in-migration and out-migration. People are fearing and anticipating things that they've seen or heard happened elsewhere because that migration happened with no plan, right? When there is no plan, you often get a lot of negative consequences. A plan can't secure you against all eventualities, but it can do a lot, to take in information about what happened elsewhere, anticipate those things and prepare for them and try to really minimize those negative impacts. So I think turning the conversation into, if this happens, how can we make it good for our community and not allow it to just be, however it happens. I think that's a really important role that the planners can play.
Rather than comment myself, I'm sort of curious what participants in this call are feeling about the answer to that question. I don't know if anybody wants to come off mute and share.
Anyone? Connor had a lot of really great comments earlier about insurance, which I think which the insurance industry and its impact on climate migration and the housing crisis is a topic that Jake Biddle deals with at great length and very, very easily inaccessible in the book. But then I think just in recent weeks, there's been a lot of media information about big insurers that are now planning to no longer offer insurance to homeowners in certain areas. And so I'm sorry, Connor, that you're at work, because I think that that's a topic that is really critical to this, to the whole topic of housing and equity and people building and living in places that probably they should not be building and living in. I don't know if anyone on the call feels that they'd like to address that either in addition to our speakers or our speakers ourselves.
This is Michal. I'll go ahead, Connor.
Go ahead, Mikhail, while Connor is finding a corner.
Cool. Fascinating discussion. Love this. I feel like I work at NYSERDA on building decarbonization and on embodied carbon. And I feel like this is kind of the discussion that no one's ready to have yet. And so it's been fascinating. So thank you for organizing and to the speakers for participating and to Officer for writing the book. I feel like the problem of people living in like the wild urban interface is an interesting one, and one that like very much seems to be addressed by insurance. And so one approach is to just not insure certain properties. And as a California native who's lived through a number of wildfires, it's very clear that people who build houses in areas that are wildfire prone are using a lot more public services than people in more let's say defensible urban areas. And so that there's definitely an equity issue, and it's not equal, right? So lower income areas don't get the same support in public services as higher income people with, let's say, nice houses in the hills. So that, I think that's one point. And another is that if insurance is the primary lever, then it means that basically there'll be very wealthy people and very poor people who end up continuing to build in these areas and not insure. So it's I feel like we need particular attention for low income folks to make sure that they're not the ones getting the raw end of the deal every time, because as we think about relocating populations, right, and if we use market-based mechanisms that and we do so voluntarily, that means that the people who have the means can move, and then whoever is left behind doesn't have those means, and then there are even fewer services available to them. So that's, I think, an area or a thing to think about of particular concern for me. So I don't know that I fully answered that question, but just sharing what's on my mind.
I have found a corner if you'd like to hear. So hi, I'm Connor. I work in mortgage industry. I work at United Wholesale Mortgage in Pontiac, Michigan. So today we have our terrible air quality as a result of wildfires in Canada. And we were just given the announcement today, although I heard it on the news a little while ago, that Allstate and State Farm, two of the largest insurers for single-family residences in the country, have announced that they are not doing any more homeowners insurance in the entire state of California. So all of the files that we had open that had a Allstate or State Farm like quote in the system getting ready to close, we had to go back and be like, just kidding, you don't have any insurance. Go get a new insurer. And that tells us that even if this is something that I've noticed and complained about, has been that there's no structural reason for mortgage lenders or Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or the individual mortgage brokers, or basically any of the people that are involved in the process of buying, building, and selling you homes, have no structural reason to account for climate change related risk at all in their analysis, because they don't hold on to the risk. The eventual investor does, and the eventual investor is backed by the United States government, so it doesn't matter. The only people that do hold on to the risk long term, and the people who just pulled out of California, are the homeowners insurance people. So the fact that two of the largest insurers have just decided that the risk associated with building properties and insuring properties in the entire state of California is high enough that they're willing to let their competitors have access to that market entirely, it should tell us something about how serious this is getting. And it's still not really being addressed with any kind of even slightly any kind of proposal to change the structure of how we do business on our end. And that terrifies me, frankly.
Yeah, it's such an important point, Connor. I mean, we saw this with flood insurance, but 50 years ago, or maybe more than that even. The reason we have the federal flood insurance program is because business-based insurance companies said this makes no sense. Like, the math doesn't work to insure homes in these super risky places. And with coastal properties, what happened is the federal government stepped in and said, well, we'll insure you instead. And so we're continuing to subsidize, not just the people who were stuck there and then found out it was dangerous, but generations of people who have moved in afterward. So I do think, something has to happen with insurance, because it does make it easier to continue the pattern that we have. But you're pointing out really important things about there's no easy answer. The all or nothing solution with insurance just leaves so many people in an impossible position. So that's obviously not the right way to handle it.
And with respect to the flood insurance question, California does actually have a similar program to Citizens Property Insurance that we have on the East Coast. which are, they're government subsidized insurance plans for flood prone areas, which is the California Fair Plan, which is insurance that you can only get if you tried to get insurance through another vendor and were not able to. And it's more expensive, but also is subsidized by the state. And when you get to that point of some of these areas are going to be basically uninsurable, it's going to be uninsurable except for California Fair Plan, which just means that that's an additional strain on the finances of the overall social net there. And because there isn't they're not able to say no to people for the most part. I think they have some structural occasions where they can, but basically that cost of insuring those locations is just going to keep going up as the risk of wildfire continues to increase. And it just seems like that problem, that is a Gordian knot that really has not been even begun to be addressed by the governments in those areas.
I hate
One
to
thing
do
I'll just,
this. Oh,
sorry.
sorry. No,
No,
no, Allison, please go ahead.
I was just gonna, so people know, there's an industry called reinsurance, who are basically the companies that insure the insurance companies. And those people are really interested in this topic and working really hard on how do we fix this, because they're the ones that at the end of the day are going to get stuck with all this risk that we're building ourselves into. So I think it should tell us all something, that the reinsurance industry is very focused on this and has a lot of folks working on it every day.
Thank you. And I hate to do this because I think this is, as we've all said, it's a topic that really has not even begun to be explored in a public, conversational, educational way. And so I really thank you all for joining us tonight, for participating. Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you and Steve and Allison to wrap up. But thank you all so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Gretchen, for keeping us on target. I think it is difficult. We knew it'd be hard to squeeze this conversation into 1 hour, but we are very aware of people's time. And we feel like there's a sweet spot in having a 1 hour format to get people to attend, participate. So we can potentially maybe look to squeezing a little more out of it for future conversations, if that's something that people respond to. But I really want to thank our speakers, both Allison and Stevie, for being here with us, offering their fantastic insights and a sense of their work at Nature Conservancy and all that you're doing in New York State and beyond. So thank you for being here and participating and being part of things. I want to thank the audience for coming to the conversation. It's great to hear some of the reactions you've had, that this is valuable. So we're very hopeful that the topic, as one person noted, it is new to be discussed, but I think we're sensing that it is important to be discussed as well as a whole. So thank you for coming and participating. I'll turn over to Allison and Stevie for any final last thoughts and leaving things hopefully on a positive note. All the work we know that is coming for all of us are continuing, but to leave it with you both.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us to join this conversation. I know it is frustrating because we could go on all night, but as some folks have noted in the chat, we could talk for a week about this issue and not be done because there's a lot of work ahead. So thank you all for participating. And to the planners that are on the phone, I just want to say, we've given you a lot of to-do list items tonight in this conversation. So I really want to say that we understand your job is not hard, but I do think it's really critical to helping our communities figure out how to move forward in a positive way. There are a lot of opportunities. We just have to take the time to make a plan so that we can seize them.
I know we're over time, so I'm just going to make this really quick. I think that there are a lot of opportunities coming up here. I think that we have seen, working in this field, working in this industry for, maybe some folks all of their career, I don't know, decades maybe, but for me, it's been 20 years. And just seeing the shift in people's view about climate change alone, it feels like it's taken forever, but I'm hoping now that that's happened, there may be a little bit quicker response to actually adapting to climate change. So I am hopeful. I mean, I feel like this conversation I've been hearing, I've been participating in a number of meetings over the last couple of months, and I'm hearing climate migration coming up again and again and again. So it's, again, just to confirm, you know, in my view, what everybody else is saying, it's a topic that people are really interested in and really thinking about. So hopefully there is something we can, some way we can continue this conversation in the future. I would love that.
Agreed. Well, we'll hope that everyone else will join us for our next session. You can find information on our website about the next book club event. And then please fill out the survey that's being sent out as well in terms of your thoughts on this and future items. Other than that, have a great evening. Thanks again for joining us and take care.